What do you listen to? Like, let's think about that this morning. What are the things we listen to? Hal just shared with us what he listens to. Gospel music in the car. What music do you listen to? Do you know that most streaming services now track the music you listen to? At the end of the year, it's actually popular to share on social media your playlist. Your Spotify playlist, your Apple Music playlist of the top artists that you listen to, the top songs you listen to, and how long you listen to. You can analytically dissect now what you listen to. And now we have these things called podcasts. Podcasts are the modern day version of talk radio. And us middle-aged white guys, we love this stuff, okay? It's just exciting. Whatever you are interested in life, whatever niche interest or hobby you might have, there is a podcast on it. And for some reason, us guys like to listen to Joe Rogan. We're attracted to him like a pig is to mud. He's the most listened to voice in America today, is the Joe Rogan podcast. What about books that you like to read or you like to listen to? I'm listening to an audiobook on mountain men right now. It's totally destroyed my view on mountain men. I'm kind of bummed after reading that. Going deeper, what news do you consume? Do you have a favorite news station, a favorite news anchor, or a paper that you read religiously? Or maybe I should ask, husbands, are you ever accused by your wives of selective listening? I plead the fifth on that one, right, Aubrey? I bring this up today because there is something in our human nature that follows what, and maybe more importantly, who we listen to. God knows this, and that is why God gave us this example we're about to read in Matthew chapter 17. Matthew takes the importance to highlight it because it is such an important issue for our human heart. Parents, you know this to be true. What do parents talk about? I hope my kids are around good friends. I hope they have good friends, because we know that generally speaking, if our kids have good friends, they generally do better things than if they have bad friends who are poor influences on them, who influence them to do bad things. And frankly, this can be true for us as adults. So as it turns out, who we listen to is really important. So pray with me about it as we dig in. Our Father in heaven, give us eyes to see and ears to hear your reign on earth as it is in heaven. Convict us of what and who we might be listening to that might be negative in our lives. And more importantly, grow in us a heart for listening to you. Pour through me the gift of preaching, that the desire for Christ's kingdom will grow in our hearts. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. Okay, to help what I'm about to read make sense, let me explain a couple things. Last week in chapter 16, we witnessed a turning point in Matthew's gospel. And I want to thank Brian for preaching on it last week, talking about the curveball. Up to that point, Jesus had been working to reveal himself as the Messiah, the Son of God, to his disciples. And then Peter makes this statement, this recognition that, oh, this is the Messiah. This is the Son of God. And everything changes from that point. A new mission starts to unfold as we see starting to emerge this week. With this background, I need to tell you a few things that you understand. You already know this to be true, in fact. Mountains are spiritual places. We know this. We live here. Go on top of a mountain this summer and listen to how people talk on top of mountains. There's no such thing as an atheist on top of a mountain. They use spiritual language, like amazing, awe-inspiring, glorious. The space between heaven and earth feels to be thin on mountains. Biblically speaking, mountains is where God chose to reveal himself to humanity. This is true for two prominent voices in the Israelites' history, both Moses and Elijah. They were both foundational in shaping God's people, and both had revelations from God on top of mountains.
First, we see with Elijah on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings chapter 18 that God proved himself by standing up against the idols of Baal and sending fire from heaven to burn up the sacrifice. Then in the next chapter, 1 Kings chapter 19, when Elijah is depressed because of all the idol worship, he goes up to the mountaintop, and through all the natural disasters, God comes and reveals himself through a calm breeze. More significantly, for what we're about to read here, is Moses. Moses led God's people to freedom and gave them the law on Mount Sinai. So see if you can pick up on the comparisons as we read Matthew chapter 17 together. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then, appearing before them, Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. And they were coming down the mountain. Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. What a crazy mountaintop experience. These 3 hanging out with Jesus, and Jesus is transfigured before them, which means he's changed in a visible way. Jesus is glowing like Moses was when God passed Moses by. In fact, Moses and Elijah, these 2 prominent voices of the Jewish people, have shown up and are having a conversation with Jesus. This is all giving validity to Jesus' voice as the King of the Jews. And Peter gets it. He understands it. He's a good Jewish boy here. He understands the Old Testament. He goes, "You know what? This is such a special occasion that we need to build 3 tents here. This seems like the right answer, because when Moses came down glowing from the mountain from being with God, he had a tent of meeting where he would go in and talk to God like it was a friend. Later on, they would do all this work to build an extravagant tent called a tabernacle. Go read the end of Exodus, and you can find every detail on how they made this tent. It was their way to celebrate being united with God. Peter's like, "God's here. We need to celebrate this. Let's make a tent." And before he gets done speaking, God interrupts him. Don't you hate it when that happens? Poor Peter. He's like, "Man, I'm trying my best here." But God gives the same words of affirmation that he gave to Jesus at Jesus' baptism. "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." The 3 disciples held up well until the point that God starts speaking. Did you notice how terrified they were? They're falling on the ground. I think we'd all respond the same way with the power, the omnipotence of God falling on the ground. And Jesus has to end the miracle there. He's to touch them, he has to comfort them, he has to tell them to calm down, and it all ends. And Jesus says, "Hey, don't tell anyone until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And all they can think of and to focus on and to ask is, does Elijah come first? I would have been asking resurrection questions here. Like, what do you mean, raised from the dead? And they're like, isn't Elijah supposed to come first? It's like an exercise in missing the point. But there's a purpose to this. The scribes had done a ton of work creating what they considered to be a timetable of what it would look like when the new Elijah, the one preparing the way for the Messiah, was to come. Things would be really bad, is basically summing it all up. Things would not be good. This is what it would look like. God would come in that moment. But they're like, whoa, where's Elijah? And Jesus has to explain. He came. John the Baptist, they didn't like it. The Herods killed him. It didn't work out really well. And it's not just a saying of what happened to John the Baptist. It's a foreshadowing. Hey, this is what's going to happen to me, is what Jesus is saying to him. They misunderstood the message, and they will misunderstand Jesus. But before we can leave this Moses comparison, we have to continue on in the next miracle. It sounds like this. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son. He said, he has had seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to you, I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. You unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, because you have so little faith. Truly, I tell you, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. So this boy is demon-possessed. And the way it manifests himself is a term that we would use called epilepsy. If you've ever witnessed someone have seizures like this, it's terrifying to witness someone have this kind of seizures. We know now, even today, it can be very threatening, especially when driving a vehicle or something, if you were to have a seizure like this. And so this boy, it's an urgent request from this father. This father wants his son healed. He calls to Jesus, even calling Jesus Lord. But Jesus is really grumpy in this story. I'm like, what's going on here, Jesus? Did you not have your morning cup of Hebrews? He is struggling. That's a dad joke. Sorry, you don't have to laugh at that one. And the reason he's grumpy is because the new Exodus is playing out just like the old Exodus. Think about the old Exodus. When they received the law, when Moses comes down from the mountain, they're worshiping a golden calf. And Moses kind of loses his temper about it. Okay, he loses his temper a lot about it, right? He slams it on the ground, he grinds it up, and he makes him drink it. The first incident of hazing ever, right? He is so upset with them. That's how Jesus is here. Yes, you're not living out what I'm teaching you. And it's kind of terrifying. It makes me nervous because I'm not sure I can drive out demons either. It's been requested. Actually, I was with a bunch of preachers, and every single one of us, it's been requested multiple times. Can this demon be driven out? What do we do here? Now, remember, in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus sent out the 12 disciples with authority to drive out demons, which they did. And now they can't drive out demons? Jesus is like, what's going on? I already taught you how to do this. Why are you struggling right now? And so Jesus gives them the reason. They have little faith. Whew, that must have been rough to hear from Jesus. Ouch, right? You have little faith. So it's helpful to understand that in Jesus' day, There was a pattern for driving out demons. This was a common thing that many people were trying to do, and it was considered, the power in driving out a demon was considered in the ritual, in the order of doing things in the correct way. In this ritual act drives out the demons, and if you didn't drive out the demon, you didn't get everything right. Jesus comes in and completely debunks this, right? Because Jesus is doing all these different weird healings and miracles, and it's not this ritual or formula. It's just the power of Jesus, right? Doing this kind of thing. And so it's thought, the scholars speculate, that that's what the disciples went back to. Like, oh, here's a demon. We'll do this kind of ritual stuff, and it didn't work. In other words, they were putting their faith in the wrong thing. So Jesus is trying to teach them something. And Jesus says one of his most famous lines that many people in the world today who maybe even don't profess to be Christians know. Truly, I tell you, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, look at this tiny mustard seed on the screen, you can say to this mountain, move, and it will move from here to there. Nothing will be impossible for you. And let me tell you, that sermon will preach up here in the mountains. I preached that one a few times here in these mountains. And unfortunately, when we preach this, including myself, we totally get it wrong because we focus on the wrong thing. See, we spend so much time about trying to grow faith the size of a mustard seed, and we miss the analogy Jesus is making. It isn't the amount of faith you have, is what Jesus is saying. It's what you have and put your faith in. It's kind of like, think about looking at the moon. You might believe the moon's up there, and you might start looking through the windows and not see the moon. But if you look through the right window where the moon is at in the night sky, you will there see the moon. In other words, it's not having a ton of faith, it's having faith in the right things. See, in life, you can have a ton of faith in a ton of things, and it will let you down. This is what it's like to be a Rockies fan. However, if you only have a little faith in the right place, by that I mean Jesus, then you can do incredible things. You can move mountains. The miracle here is not in the size of our faith. The miracle here is in the size of our God. Placed and invested in the right place, faith can move mountains. And the dad of the son who's experiencing this demon is the metaphor of what it is like to do this. He's been waiting for the disciples to heal him. It's not working out. And he runs to Jesus. Lord, he's placing his mustard seed size faith in Jesus, and he is rewarded for it. So let me ask some follow-up questions. Where in your life have you been putting your faith? How has it seemed or hasn't seemed to be working out? How can you have a mustard seed amount faith in your life? What mountains can God only move in your life? See, in response to all this, Jesus gives them this teaching. When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of man. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life. And the disciples were filled with grief. Jesus is trying to explain the battle plan, the strategy, the way he will win the war against evil. And they can't listen to Jesus. All they can do is hear their own feelings, their feelings of grief, feelings we can relate to because still over 2,000 years later, it's hard to understand. Why did Jesus have to die on a cross for the world? They are all grieving and they can't hear the message. But if we listen carefully today, we can hear the message because there is more than a word here for you and I. All this chapter, in fact, is pointing to 3 words. 3. In order to understand this chapter, you have to remember, like I said earlier, when Peter says of Jesus, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of the living God. So consider this. That's last chapter. If Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, then what would you need to do? What would you need to alter in your life? What would be important? Well, it'd be important to listen to him, right? Might want to listen to that guy, Son of God. So it's so important, in fact, that God himself, after affirming Jesus for a second time, God adds 3 of the most important words. Listen to him. Church, I have good news for you this morning. Good news. This is incredible that God sent his Son for us to listen to. How exciting is that? That with all the things, the distractions, the things that can bring us down, the bad voices in life, that we have a voice to listen to. So comforting to hear that. Yet it sounds so difficult because we know it's so difficult, right? With all the noises, with all the other voices in life, can we listen to him? Because the real question is, we are listening to him or we are not listening to him. We are doing one of those two things. And the consequences of not listening to Jesus are so great and they can be so devastating that I want to give you 2 current examples of how I have seen them hurt both an individual Christian and an entire church family. See, I told you before about my friend and mentor, Mike Myers. Mike Myers was a full-time minister in Churches of Christ for over 50 years. Mike has Church of Christ awards named after him, Church of Christ scholarships named after him, Church of Christ buildings named after him, right? One of the more significant people in Church of Christ, the generation before us. And Mike had a heart attack when we were working together. Went through that, he was recovering, he came and sat in my office, and the conversation that he had still stands out to me clear as day. He was talking to me about the directions that his cardiologist gave him. And there were, things that I expected to be normal instructions. Exercising, eating healthy, those sorts of things. But there was one that confused me. His doctor's actual medical orders were to stop watching the news. Mike, this Christian man, was a news junkie. He loved to watch the news, to see everything going on, and all the heartache that comes from the news was breaking his heart. Literally. It was killing him. That was the voices in this Christian man that in many ways should be so influential and is influential to us, that those voices were breaking him down, because I don't know if we're built to handle all that negativity all the time. I know this because, maybe I went through a point of being guilty of the same thing. See, in 2020, knowing the story that I just told you, I consumed a ton of media. Why? Because my justification was there was a lot of regulations changing all the time, and I needed to know how to adjust and adapt to that in the ministry context. There were conversations going on in our churches about various things. I was trying to stay up so I could pastor and minister to the people in our church who were dealing with these different issues. And Aubrey called me out on it. I had selective listening for a while. I confess there, honey. But I actually listened to her and have cut back my news consumption significantly. In fact, I might disappoint you sometimes because many of you say, "Did you hear about this?" And I go, "No, I didn't," because I hadn't been watching. And it's been great to have that feeling, to lose that burden of maybe other voices carrying a greater weight than God's voice in my life. Now let me give you another challenge. Let me tell you how not listening to Jesus killed a church. Not a church far away, not a church that we aren't so unconnected with, but in 2020, with all the social unrest that happened, it killed a Church of Christ here in our state, in Colorado. The church was almost 3 times our size. was talking to the preacher of the church, a good friend of mine. He explained to me painfully the autopsy of what happened to that church. See, all the voices of 2020 have infected the church with something much worse than COVID. They believed their specific voices they were listening to so much that they were all so polarized with each other that they couldn't worship and break bread together. That the preacher started meeting with families individually, having coffee or meals and conversations, trying to figure out a way that they could come back together again and function as a church. And he said a line to me that still sticks with me today. He said, "Tyler, I used to think I was the only preacher for my church, and then I realized that each individual had dozens of preachers that they listened to through various forms of media, and as it turns out, I was the preacher they listened to the least." In other words, what he was saying is they stopped listening to this being proclaimed, and they started listening to the voices of the world, and they are now dead as a church because of that. And if that doesn't shake you to your core, I don't know what will. But as we conclude today, I want to end on a story that's positive. The story of Louis Klops. This guy was born in March 7th, 1852 in Germany. He was brought to America by his father after the death of his mother. And I think about all the difficulty and challenges of immigrating to America, of learning English, of grieving the loss of his mother. But Louis started studying journalism, and it was at what is now Columbia University. He rose from stock boy to editor with this religious publisher, and by 1880 he was the owner and editor of the American edition of the Christian Herald magazine. Louis cared deeply about listening to the words of Jesus, so much so that he raised $4 million to help people suffering from famine in places like Russia and India. He helped Italy after an earthquake and founded a children's home here in America. He was serious about listening to Jesus. But none of this was his greatest work. In fact, his greatest work still influences you and I today. In 1899, Louis was moved by the significance of Jesus' words so much that he had the idea to highlight Jesus' words red in the Bible. In 1901, they sold their first copies with record sales, 60,000 copies of these red letter Bibles the first year they printed them. By the time of Louis's death in 1910, they sold over 200,000 red letter Bibles. And I don't know about you, church, but I like red letter Bibles. I like them because when I open them up, I'm like, okay, when those words are read, I better pay attention, right? That's Jesus speaking. This is the one that we are told to listen to. God's words didn't get highlighted in red. I don't know why. Someone will have to look that up and tell me. But Jesus' words are written in red. And so as we try to listen to Jesus, I think about how sometimes these words written in red are comforting. I think about sometimes how these words are challenging. How these words are always loving, but sometimes the love is tougher than I'd like it to be. Sometimes I really wrestle with the words written in red, and sometimes these words give me peace. But I find that Peter and the other disciples give me hope because they're trying so hard to listen to Jesus, and they're totally getting it wrong in chapter 17 and really throughout all of Matthew's gospel. And in grace, they try and they try again until these words written in red completely transform their life. So what do you say? Never in the history of the world have you had more voices to listen to. Do you know, this blew my mind when I learned this. Stuff uploads to YouTube faster then you can actually watch it. In other words, you could be streaming all day long as much as you could on just one platform, YouTube, and never watch it all. Poor Tim Masterson couldn't even find our sermons here at the church on our website because the search can be difficult at times. So you have that on one hand. But never more in life have you had more opportunities through all these same platforms to listen to the words of God, to hear Jesus speak. You might have to search a little bit more for it. You might have to dig and find, but it is there. Jesus' voice is still speaking. There's just one question. Will you listen to him?